So now I've got it on my work surface, and I just unpinned the other side so that it's flat. And I'm going to true up my waist here. Ooh, it's a little bit on the curvy side, which is nice. And I'm going to use this, the armhole curve. It seems to be matching up perfectly. And I'm going to sort of go around here. So there's my waistline. It's all trued up. And I'm going to mark my darts here like this. I find it easier just to do it on the table rather than trying to do it on the garment. Bring it out into where your seam allowance would be, because you want to make sure that you don't forget to true up that part of it. And I am going to take a straight ruler. I'm going to go down the center of my dart. Let me move that over so you can see it. And then I'm going to come over here. Do both sides of the dart. So the dart was out here like this. It looks like my dart was over a little bit. It was a bit of a curve. So we'll see if this works out okay, or if we need to make any changes to that. I'm going to come up here where these little pleats were, and I want to make sure that I don't lose those. So the first thing I want to do is true up my shoulder line. So here's the edge of the shoulder near the arm, and here is where it was next to the neck. So I'm going to make sure that even though I have lines going all over the place in different directions, that I've trued that up. And I'm going to turn it over. I want to pull my, I'm going to pull the facing out from there. So I'm just going to release the fabric, but repin it, because I want to get the other side of the pleats correct. So I'm removing, here's our facing, and you'll notice that the facing and the shoulder seam are doing kind of a V. That is correct. Do not cut this off, because this has to line up with that over there. But I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to take my ruler, and I'm going to trace that shoulder line on the back so that I know where the point of this pleat is hitting the shoulder. And I'm going to do a little line here to intersect along the fold, because I want to know where the inside of the fold is and where the outside of the fold align. So this is going to align right there. That one's going to align there. So you see how I've colored the edge, and I've also marked the line where it's going to line up, because I just really don't want to lose all that hard work I just did. This is going to be the fold. This becomes the facing. So when I open this up, what I hope to see is the lines for my pleats. And so you can see that there's a line here. So you draw that line. I'm going to draw this one. These are right on the fold. So don't try to make them square and straight. You're following what you've already draped. So you can see they go at angles. And then here's this one. So from pinching the fabric, I can see where those are. And this one folds. That's the inside of the fold, and it comes over to there. So that's where it's going to land. So I'm basically going to make sure that I duplicate the line of where that pleat is going to end up. And from this point here to there, this is being folded from there to here. So I always make an arrow so I don't forget. So this is the center of the pleat. You might want to put a C. That's the part that's going to be hidden. This one I'm folding over to there. And so you can see where it lines up is right there. So it's lining up with this line here, but here's my center over there. So here's the center. And this pleat is going from here to here. So yes, they're not the same size. We're not trying to do a pleated skirt where we have pleats that match up exactly from one side to the next. These are your drapes, and the angles are what creates the way it drapes down and around. So you can see that your seam also is kind of straight here, and then it sort of twists and comes back. So your seam allowance is going to follow that dimension. So here's our center front. We've got our dart. You can mark your armhole. Where the armhole comes up to the shoulder seam, it should be, you know, pretty straight. And then the same thing under the arm. You don't want it to, like, here's where we go under the arm. I'm just going to draw through to my seam allowance because we don't want this to come up to a point and do that. You'd be very frustrated when you go to sew it because it's not gonna work. And then I'm gonna connect this armhole all the way around. Try to connect my stuff as best as I can. So that looks pretty good. So then I want to true up the end of this dart. So if this is folded over, and lines up here, most of the time when we do darts, the excess fabric on the inside goes down or towards the center. But you can see if I do that here, that would change my side seam. So this dart, this French dart, I generally have the excess going upward so that you're not adding any excess fabric down at the waist, because that is going to create a pulling effect. So I'm going to pin this back in. I'm going to pin this dart in. And I'm going to true up my side seam. So I go from the spot under the arm to the place where it intersects at the waist. And I'm going to square this up. And this is that truing up process that I talk about all the time, that I really want to see you guys doing on all of your patterns. This is your opportunity to make sure that everything's square and accurate before you move on to putting it in on paper. And to true up the end of the dart, we actually have to look at where does that dart fold come to on the other side. And most of the time I just kind of do this. If I'm in paper, I'll poke holes with my pins. And so you'll see that this dart, to actually make the dart, we wind up with it coming from the waistline up to the center line of the dart, and then it turns and goes horizontal and connects this way. So you don't have a dart where you're getting a point coming down. You've got one that's more squared out. So then I like to take my scissors and just go around and trim down any excess fabric so that I basically have, you know, a ½ inch or maybe a little more seam allowance. So make sure at the waist that you're, you know, clipping so that this can follow the curve of the waist. I'm going to come up the side and trim all this up. And when I do that, if this was a ½ inch seam, I would have already created that little jog at the end of the dart that's the trued up end. I'm going to go around this arm's eye, same thing. Too much excess fabric can really restrict what it is that we're trying to create here. And again, your armholes should be clipped into so that there's no pulling. And I you know, in clothing construction, I really explain to everyone why we need to clip it, but I think it's never not a good reason to reiterate that if I take my ruler and I measure my arm's eye, it's basically 7 inches. If I measure my seam allowance, it's actually 6 inches. So this dimension is much smaller than this dimension, and it's going to end up, when it's folded and pressed over here, which is actually 8 inches. So you cannot take something that's 6 and make it lay flat on something that's 8 and not pull and draw your fabric. So if you were to fold your seam allowance over, you'll see how in order for it to lay flat, you get all those little V's that are opening of the fabric, and it's going to be most intense here under the armhole. And I often see, and I did notice on everyone's facings, that you had some pulling, the fabric was rolling to the outside, and it's always because you don't have enough notches cut into, or clipped edges, slashes, in that area. Here I can see that it needs another one right there, and it probably needs another one here. In order for this to really lay down nice and smooth and open up and not restrict that armhole. So if you like to do things that will help you remember something later and make some sense, what I would do is get a piece of paper, draft an armhole, bend your ruler or your tape measure, take a measurement, mark down that this was 6, this was 7, this was 8, and clip this and fold the paper over. I know you guys think that fabric stretches, but it doesn't stretch that much. And if you can't fold it over in paper and have it not tear, well, then it's going to restrict the movement in your fabric. So when you get to making your final garment, I'm going to be a real stickler about the fact that these armholes better look really good. You better have clipped them. So here for my shoulder seam, I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm going to trim it up a bit for my seam allowance, and then I'm going to fold this in half, and I'm going to trace everything, or at least cut everything the same, and then I will mark my dart, mark my pleats at the shoulder. And so I'm just going to take this down about 1/4 of an inch all the way around, and that's going to give us a trued up seam allowance at the shoulder. So see how this comes kind of straight, but then it goes out. It's kind of like the same thing when you're truing up a dart. This pleat that's folded in is getting smaller as it goes toward the center. So the end of it is truly an angle and not a straight line. So we're going to take this and we're going to open it all up, and we're going to fold it in half at the that center line. I'm going to pin it, because you want to really pin fit this before you draft the paper pattern. Because this is, a drape cowl, and it's symmetrical, not asymmetrical. Both sides should be the same. And I like to do a pin fit before I draft this on paper, and then go ahead and make my paper pattern. So I want to be really careful. So I'm really smoothing this out. Don't try to iron it and accidentally stretch it. That can happen. So I'm folding this over, and I'm adding some pins. Don't put the pins too close to the edge because you're going to be trimming it. So be careful not to stretch. I'm just going to hold it down, and I'm going to take my scissors, and you can follow along in your book. Unfortunately, my book, these pages are missing. So I'm doing this from memory, or from the way that I would do it. I have another book that I looked in, and it's slightly a different method. Each person that writes a book, you've got books written by Connie Crawford, and who's the one that wrote our book? It's Helen Joseph Armstrong, and their techniques are slightly different. I have both sets of books because I like to be able to look up how one person might suggest you do something versus another. They're both very well respected in the industry, and they write textbooks for a lot of the schools. I've taught at 2 different colleges besides Wayne State, and both of them used one or the other book. And so they're across the country, a lot of the universities use that same book. So I'm cutting out my arm's eye. I hope you guys are learning all this new language when we talk about the armhole. On a pattern, it's called the arm's eye. It's not called an armhole because you may be attaching a sleeve to it, so they always refer to it as the arm's eye. And you can take tracing paper and transfer your draped pleats, transfer your markings for your seam allowance and your dart and your waistline, transfer all of that, and then we'll open it up, we'll pin it, and we'll pin fit it to the dress form. So I've taken and pinned my little pleats in at the shoulder and the darts. And once I pin it to my dress form, I'm kind of just fussing a little bit with this drape. This is cotton muslin, and it has some sizing on it when they process the fabric. It's a little stiffer than some of your more drapey fabrics would be. You can imagine here's something that's very silky if I was to drape this with a very silky kind of fabric. We're going to get a much nicer drape when we start pulling up the gathers on the side. It's going to lay better at the neck than this cotton muslin is going to lay because it's very stiff. But so now we've got the whole front pattern by having draped one side, folded it in half, and duplicated it. And this is on the bias, so this will relax and fall down flatter and be really quite a nice dramatic sort of look to our garment. So do your best. It's a little bit more of a complicated pattern, and this will be the last one that you drape, make a paper pattern, sew your little sample, and submit those pictures.